You know what makes a podcast interview really great? Asking great questions. That's why in this video, I'm going to help you better understand exactly what you need to know to ask the best questions possible during your podcast interview. We've all been there before. We've heard a podcast interview that absolutely makes us cringe. Why? Because the right questions simply aren't asked, and the art of an interview is not on full display. In this video, we're going to help you change all of that if you've ever been there, or if you haven't, how to avoid it completely. Let's dive in. The first tip I want to share with you today is making sure that you do the ample preparation for the podcast interview. Winging it in general with anything, specifically in podcast interviews, is a terrible idea. I mean, terrible idea. Why? Because, lack of preparation always sets us up for some sort of, disaster. And it's completely avoidable with a little bit of preparation. You want to make sure that you are doing the proper research on your guests to know exactly who you're talking to, but more importantly, to help you understand exactly the questions you want to ask. It really needs to be a mix of open-ended questions, keep the conversation going, and specific questions that you really want to ask your guests in order to have a combination of making it a very, very interesting conversation. But none of that happens unless you actually prepare for the interview. So tip number one in this video is making sure you prepare yourself for the podcast interview. Do the research you need to on your guest and formulate the questions, the different kind of questions that you want to ask throughout the interview. Now, speaking of questions, the next tip I want to share with you is how to create open-ended questions versus specific questions or close-ended questions that just simply require a yes or a no. An open-ended question requires someone to utilize a free form, basically giving you their opinion and their explanation of your question. Not just, do you like to go to the park on Saturday? Yes, I do. What has been your experience when you've gone to a park on Saturday afternoon? You see the difference there? One's giving you a yes or no answer. One is making and almost forcing your guests to elaborate on the question that you're asking, making for even more meaningful content. Now, in addition to asking open-ended questions, you also want to integrate storytelling within those questions. So asking them why they like to go to the park on Saturday and give some examples of some past experiences would allow you to extract not only an answer from them from an open-ended question, but would also encourage them to tell you a bit of a story based on the question being asked. Open-ended questions and storytelling, very, very powerful when utilized together as a combination in the form of asking questions during your podcast interview. Next, I want to talk to you about balancing the structure and having some flexibility within the flow or the outline of questions that you want to ask during a podcast episode. What I mean about this is having flexibility with going where the conversation goes. Now, this does not mean wing it. We've talked about that earlier. Do not wing it under any circumstances. Have an outline, have a list of questions, both specific and open-ended, that you can ask, but sometimes just based on the nature of the conversation, or maybe even an answer that your guest gives you from a question that you've asked them, can actually trigger you to want to ask an additional question that you may have not planned to ask. So when I say remain flexible to the structure, that's what I mean. You never really know where the conversation's going to go. You have a good idea because you've got a outline in place and you've got questions in place, or at least you should. That's why you're watching this video, to better understand exactly how to ask better questions and how to better lead a podcast interview with your guests. But stay open, stay flexible, because as you know, with conversation, often not necessarily getting off on a tangent. That does happen. It's your job as the host to keep things on track. But sometimes you hear something and you want to know more. You want to ask another question that you may not have scripted out. So remain flexible in addition to sticking with the structure and the questions that you've come up with prior to the podcast interview. Flexibility, major key when it comes to creating a good podcast interview and asking great podcast questions. All right, next, let's talk about leading questions. Try not to do too much of this either. A leading question is you asking a question because you want a specific answer from your guest. This can also lead to an awkward moment that nobody really needs during a podcast interview. So try not to ask leading questions. Open-ended questions and specific questions of things that you really actually want to know make far more sense and make for far better content during a podcast interview. So try to steer away from the leading questions and focus more on open-ended and strategic specific questions. Now, if you're a talker or you're uncomfortable in a space of silence, this next tip may be a little challenging for you, but it's not impossible. Ready? Get comfortable with silence and also embracing the power of the pause. You see what I did there? Silence can actually work to your advantage as a podcast host when conducting a podcast interview. Why? Because it almost forces your guests to want to talk even more or expand even more on their answer. They're not always expecting you to dive right in once they're answering a question. In fact, sometimes some people don't even know how to end the answer to the question, and they just keep going and going and going. And then, of course, it's your job as the podcast host to step back in and regain control of the conversation. But more times than not, creating an interesting conversation comes from the host being as silent as possible after you've asked a question, even after you've gotten the answer to the question that you've asked. And don't be afraid to ask a question, pause for a half a second or one, and then elaborate a little bit more on the question that you're asking. Or you may be simply replying back to the answer that they gave you on a question that you're answering. The power of the pause is real, both in public speaking, comedy, hosting a podcast interview. So this tip is all about embracing silence to add to the conversation and also embracing the power of the pause. And the final tip we've got for you on creating great questions for your podcast interview is to crowdsource. Ask your network and community to help you out. Make a post on Facebook or LinkedIn or shoot a clip for Instagram and ask, hey, listen, I've got a guy named Sebastian Rusk who's the founder of the Podcast Launch Lab. He helps people launch podcasts in 90 days or less so they can grow their business and increase sales. What questions should I ask him? People love to give their feedback. People love to chime in. So let them. It can, in fact, help you ask even more interesting questions. And you could even frame it up during the interview as, okay, as we wrap up this podcast interview, we like to close things out by having a couple of our audience questions asked. Yesterday, I posted something on Facebook letting them know that you were going to be on the show, and we had a couple questions roll in, and I'd like to ask those now if you're okay with that. All right, first question comes from Bob in Spokane, Washington. Crowdsourcing is very, very powerful on all kinds of fronts, but when it comes to podcast interviews, it can really help make your job as a podcast host just that much easier. Well, I hope you're leaving this video knowing at least one or two things that you did not know about making sure your podcast interview questions are as good and as great as they possibly can be. Questions, thoughts, ideas, concerns about this video or any videos on the channel, please comment below. I do respond to each and every one of you lovely people. Until next time, go get out there and create some great podcast interview questions.